So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and we're very welcome here to Clifton House for our talk this evening. So my name is Dr. Lauren Smith, and I am the historian here of Clifton House, the Belfast Charitable Society, and the Mary Ann McCracken Foundation. So I'm responsible for telling all the research and the stories about this wonderful place. And it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening, the Belfast Charitable Society's very own president, and a familiar face at our talk series, Sir Ronnie Weatherup, whose talk this evening will focus on the early history of the Belfast Charitable Society. So just a wee bit of context for this evening's talk. So in the bustling streets of 18th century Belfast, amidst the growing concerns over the welfare of the city's impoverished residents, a group of compassionate merchants and civic-minded individuals convened in 1752 to establish the Belfast Charitable Society. Founded with the vision of providing relief to the needy, especially the sick and destitute, this pioneering organisation marked a significant step towards formalised charitable efforts in Ireland. Rooted in a shared sense of community responsibility, the Society laid the groundwork for future social initiatives, embodying the spirit of benevolence that would shape Belfast's charitable landscape for generations to come. Now, before we begin this evening's talk, I need to mention some housekeeping, as we do. So for those in the room, there is no planned fire alarms today, but one does happen to go off. Please evacuate immediately, and the Clifton House staff, which would be myself and James, who's hiding in the corner, will assist you down the stairs. For bathrooms, please turn right when you leave the boardroom, and please switch off all mobile phones and devices to silent. For those who are attending online, everyone will be muted at the start of the talk, and please ensure that you remain muted throughout so we can minimise disruption. And please ensure that your camera is switched off, and you can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions, which will be answered at the end of the talk. So, and finally, to introduce our speaker. So Sir Ronnie, who was appointed President of the Belfast Charitable Society in 2018. He was a law graduate of Queen's University Belfast and a barrister who was appointed a judge of the High Court in 2001. He was also a judge of the Court of Appeal in 2015 and then later retired in 2017. But we've been very fortunate to have a president who's taken such an interest in our history and is very keen to do his research of his own. So now I will hand you over to Sir Ronnie, who is going to tell us more about the president and the 8 assistants who made up the Belfast Charitable Society. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and good evening, everyone. You're all welcome to this wonderful building, which opened in 1774, and that is what my story is about. Events of 1774 and the opening of this building and the passing of legislation in the Irish Parliament, which established the Belfast Charitable Society as a legal entity in that year. And you may be interested to know that the Act of the Irish Parliament is still the law of the land in relation to the Belfast Charitable Society, because 3 of its sections which established it, which vested this property, which was held by trustees, in the president and assistants of the society and allowed it to hold the property as a charity, are all still the basis on which the Charitable Society operates, although its more wide-ranging powers have been updated in legislation introduced in 1996, but the original act still applies. Now, at that time, Belfast had a population of about 10,000 people, and as Lauren has said, they opened originally in a meeting in 1752, but it took quite a long time, 18 years, before they actually got the business going when this building was completed and it was incorporated as a legal entity at that time. So what it did was it introduced a poorhouse, which was unique at the time because throughout Ireland they had passed legislation to introduce what they called houses of industry. And they were meant to hold people who were begging, in effect. It was a measure to clear begging off the streets to punish those who were begging who didn't need to, because they were the deserving poor, and they were the ones who were unable to work by age or infirmity. But they were the undeserving poor, the sturdy beggars. They were the ones who were able to work but chose to beg. This assumes there was work available, of course, but it's a distinction you might hear echoes of today, but it was very prevalent at that time, because of course all of this funding was private funding, and the people who were subscribing to this organization wanted to know that their money was being well spent on what they called the truly needy. So I don't want to be too starry-eyed about this, but when this building opened, it was designed to accommodate the poor, but it was also designed as a kind of correction centre for those who were called sturdy beggars, as I've said, because they were liable to be detained here. And this society had powers of arrest and detention, and they could detain the people who shouldn't have been begging, didn't have a license to beg because it's licensed. And there's a black hole which is downstairs where you could be confined, a kind of solitary confinement. It's the little room as you go past this, down the stairs to the front door, look to your right and you'll see a door. That's the black hole where you were put, and it still doesn't have any windows. It also opened as an infirmary, because there was no hospital in Belfast at that time for the poor. If you had any money, you paid your doctor and you came to see. If you were poor and had no money, well, you had to rely on the charity of the medical profession. And there was no hospital in the town. There was a hospital in Lisburn, which was the county infirmary. But of course, if you were a poor person in Belfast in 1774, you weren't going to get to Lisburn because you would have had to walk or get a horse and trap, I suppose, if you could have to pay for that. So it was impossible for county infirmaries. Just think what it was like if you lived in Ballintoy and you had to go to the county infirmary. It was in Lisburn. It probably took you a day to get there. Belfast opened an infirmary here and had 6 beds made, gave instructions to the carpenter as to how they should be made, and they were installed in the building, and they introduced people to them. Now, what I'm going to do, my exercise, is to look at the legislation that was passed in 1774, because it established a board for this society of 9 people. I'm going to look at those 9 people because they're reflective of the times and who they represented. Now, I have to have a drink. If I've got this working, there's some of them. That's a preliminary. There's one of the first pictures of the Clifton house on the right there. Here we have it again. Lauren has done the introductions. Here we are, Clifton House, the beginnings. There it is again. And here they are. Now, I've grouped them into 3 groups, but there are 9 people. One is landowners. You see there, he was the president, Earl of Donegal. The second group I've called public representatives, the sovereign, that's the mayor, and the 2 MPs for Belfast. It was a very small city, town. It wasn't a city, it was a borough. It had 2 MPs. And the other representatives were from the Church of Ireland, the Church Warden, and 3 Presbyterians, you see. So I want to have a look at who these people were. I should say that you could also be a member of the society. You had to pay a guinea a year, and you had membership. And if you were a member, you could nominate poor people to be admitted to the home. And then there was a committee in the home, and the committee decided whether you were worthy. And if you were admitted into the home. So the first person is Arthur Chichester. And there he is, looking fine and dandy. A wealthy man, of course, an absentee landlord, quite prevalent in Ireland at the time. Owned vast estates in Ireland, although he lived in England. He lived at a place called Fisherwick Hall, which was in Staffordshire. You know that name has been carried over into Belfast since that time. He was the owner of 90,000 acres in County Antrim, as well as lands in Donegal and lands in Wexford, which had come down to him through the family. It was said that his estates produced an income of £48,000 a year. Now, this is 1774, and I don't know what that translates into today, but it must be in the £1,000,000 bracket, I suppose, but I don't know how you could translate it. But anyway, a very wealthy man indeed. So how did he come to that position? Well, the first Arthur Chichester had come to Ireland during the 9 Years' War. If you remember your history, the Gaelic lords rose in rebellion in the 1590s. I get my centuries right. And Hugh O'Neill was the leader of the Gaelic lords. He was defeated at Kinsale in 1601, and eventually the wars ended in 1603. And all those who supported him lost their lands, although they were re-granted in various forms. And one of those was Shane McBrien O'Neill, and he owned this land here and all of South Antrim, because it was Lower Clandyboy. He was the last lord of Clandyboy. His lands were forfeited because he had sided with O'Neill. Bad mistake, forfeiture of lands granted to Chichester and others. He himself was granted some lands around Randallstown. Shane's Castle is named after Shane O'Neill. His family retained 100,000 acres in the Randallstown area. And Chichester and others who were adventurers, military people, came from a family in Devon, and Chichester was granted these lands. So he was the first Arthur to get the lands that were to become the city of Belfast. He was obviously an able man, because he became Lord Deputy of Ireland, and he was Lord Deputy for 10 years, from 1605 to 1615. And that, of course, as you know, covers the period of the plantation and other events involving the settlements in Ireland at that time. Now, that's the background. This Arthur Chichester is the 5th Earl, so it's come down through the family. He has inherited all these lands. And I just want to tell you one event about him, but it concerns a group called the Hearts of Steel. Now, this was a rebellion, rising, insurrection of sorts, which happened in 1770, because the first Arthur Chichester had granted lands, tenancies to a lot of settlers, and they were mostly Presbyterian, and there were a lot of lands granted to that effect around Templepatrick, and rents were coming for review, and leases were expiring, and new leases were being granted. And what was the fear was that families that had been on these lands for many years would lose their farms. They carried out improvements. You didn't get benefit for improvements at that time. You still had to pay your rent. It may go up because you'd improved the property. But middlemen came in and bought the lands when they came up for renewal. And these middlemen were merchants and entrepreneurs, and they sublet. So rents were going up. Some farmers couldn't afford them. Tenants were evicted if they wouldn't agree to pay the new rents or couldn't afford to pay the new rents. Families had been on the lands for many years, found they had lost their farms. So a group is formed called the Hearts of Steel, and the Hearts of Steel object to this practice. Eventually in 1770, because one of their leaders, who was a man called Douglas, was arrested and brought to the jail in Belfast, they marched from Templepatrick. Again, as I say, most of the tenants around there were Presbyterians, and they were rebelling because of the way they were then being treated. And it is said that by the time they reached Belfast on a march, there were 1,000 people in the march, and they came to demand the release of Douglas from the jail. There was rioting and so forth, and the house of one of the men who was said to be one of the middlemen, Waddell Cunningham, we'll come back to him, was set on fire, and what's now Royal Avenue is where his house was, around where Primark was his house, set on fire. But eventually the authorities conceded, Douglas was released, and the men returned home. But the rebellion was resulted in quite a lot of agrarian crime and so forth. And that resulted in executions taking place, because when they apprehended some of these people who were responsible, the death penalty was applied. Others were sent to America. So it was quite a significant event. And John Wesley toured the north of Ireland in 1773, and he notes in his diary at that time in relation to the Hearts of Steel and what Donegal had done by evicting tenants and so forth. He put it like this: it's no wonder that as their lives were now bitter to them, they should fly out as they did. His sympathies were obviously, as no doubt they all are, with the people who were wronged at that time. That was the event of 1770. Just before, on the good side, he granted 19 acres here for us to build this, and the surrounding lands, all of which have now been disposed of, apart from the graveyard, which is down at the back, which was part of the original grant. As to the landlords, well, they've all lost their lands. The Land Acts resulted in the land purchase schemes. So all of these absentee landlords found that their properties, their estates were purchased by the tenants eventually, about 100 years ago. All those annuities have now been paid, and there's been a land settlement. As to this land, these lands of Belfast, well, Arthur had a very extravagant son, and he died with enormous debts, and they had to put their estate up for sale through a mechanism that then existed in order to pay the debts. And the only lands that remained devolved to a daughter of the family in the absence of sons. She was a Harriet, married the Earl of Shaftesbury, and one of the lands that were owned by the original Chichester was Lough Neagh, and as you may know, the Shaftesburys still own Lough Neagh, and they're being interviewed. You see the latest Earl of Shaftesbury being interviewed about the algae in the loch, and the state want to buy the loch, or the bed of the loch, from the Shaftesbury estate. It's in the Shaftesbury estate because the first Earl of Chichester was granted the loch. There's a question mark about how that happened, but that's still in the hands of the Shaftesbury family. That's the landowning side of things. He was president for life of the Charitable Society. He died in 1799, and his son, then the delinquent son, took over. Now, I better move on. I took rather a long time if I'm going to do 9 of these. So this man will be rather quicker because he was the mayor of Belfast. He was called a sovereign. We don't know when he died, but he was born in 1717, as you see. So he was about 57 years old when the Charitable Society was established. Now, the origins of the Sovereign of Belfast go back to the grant of Belfast. When Chichester was granted this land, there was nothing to Belfast but 2 buildings. One, the castle, which was in Castle Place, which was ruined. And secondly, the church on the site of what is now St. George's Church in High Street. And it too was not in great condition. There wasn't a settlement here at that time. The church was a chapel of ease because that was the site of the ford across the Lagan. Belfast is the mouth of the ford of the sand, and so that was the ford across the river, and the castle was between the 2 rivers, the Falstaff, the Farset and the Blackstaff, a defensive position looking towards Malone, Stranmillis, as well as people coming from the north and across the river. And so forth. So that was all there was to Belfast. Chichester set about building it and developing High Street as he did. Rebuilt the castle, rebuilt the church at that time. And James I granted a charter to Belfast, and he established a town council of a sovereign and 12 burgesses. And that remained the town council in 1774. And each year they the 12 burgesses elected the sovereign. And you see that James Lewis was sovereign on 3 occasions. Now, this was all in the hands of Donegal, in effect, because you had to submit the 3 names for election to Donegal. There had to be 3 of the burgesses, and he approved the 3 burgesses, and then so it's a pocket, or it's a pocket borough for the local government. It's also a pocket borough for Parliament, because although there were only a few hundred people, Belfast became a borough. The 12 burgesses became the electorate. Chichester was in charge, so he was really appointing the mayor and the 2 members of Parliament, who were elected by the 13 people on the council. That was how it worked. That system actually remained until 1840 in the reformed local government in Ireland. So at 1770, this was still a pocket borough. Now, moving on, here's the first MP that I want to talk about, Henry Skeffington. He was the MP for Belfast for nearly 30 years, as you see there, 1768 to 97. He was based in Ireland and had been at Trinity, and became the MP in 1768. His grandmother was a Chichester, and as you would expect, his father was the Viscount Mazarine of Antrim, and they lived in Antrim Castle. They're another landed family. They're related to the Chichesters, and he gets the nod as the local MP. You see, his father there was called Clockworthy Skeffington. What a name! I love it. Now, Skeffington, there was a William Skeffington who was Lord Deputy of Ireland in the 16th century. And then with Chichester came a Hugh Clockworthy. So the 2 families were here. And then there is a point at which John marries Mary, and the Skeffingtons and the Clockworthys get together. And what do they call their son? Clockworthy Skeffington. And then Clockworthy Skeffington becomes the name that the eldest son gets for the next 5 or 6 generations. And this, Henry's father was the Clockworthy Skeffington. Henry had an older brother whose name was Clockworthy, and he was due to become the next Viscount. But Clockworthy was perhaps as they not regarded as entirely trustworthy, because the father died, as you see there, in 1757, and Clockworthy became the new Viscount. That would be the 6th. Clockworthy, the son, became the Viscount. That is brother of Henry. And he was only 15 when his father died. And he, a few years later, decided the thing that a gentleman does at that time is to do the grand tour of Europe. And he went to Europe, but he fell into debt in Paris and was put in the debtor's prison in 1769. Now, in those days, you paid your way in prison. And of course, he came from a wealthy family and his mother sent him money. So he was able to pay for all the high life that you are entitled to live within the confines of a prison. But he wouldn't settle with his creditors. And believe it or not, he was still in the prison in 1789, 20 years later. But what happened in 1789 in Paris? He was released when the Bastille, he wasn't in the Bastille, but at that time, rioting in Paris, he got away and he escaped and he came to London. And he ran into debt in London at that time. His mother was still sending him money. And he lived in London for a time, and he recruited a housekeeper called Elizabeth Blackburn. And when he came back to Antrim, eventually in 1800, and he brought his housekeeper with him, Elizabeth Blackburn, and next he married her. And then he died in 1805, and he left what he could to Elizabeth Blackburn. Now, when he died, who's the next in line as the Viscount? Our friend Henry, no longer MP, but he's now due to become the 7th Viscount Mazarine. But all the property other than that in the family settlement has been left to the wife. So there's a contest in Dublin, action against him, claim of undue influence to affect the will is upheld, and eventually they settle the claim. Henry pays the widow £15,000 and 800 a year. So she came out of it all right, and he got all the remaining assets. The Antrim Castle was burnt down in the Troubles in 1922. So there's no longer an Antrim Castle, but the grounds are owned by the Antrim County Council now. And there still is a Viscount Skeffington, but I think he would regard himself as English now, as the family are long removed. Now I have to move on to George Hamilton. I'm just going to pause a moment to look at the time, because I have to keep an eye on the time, or Lauren will wave at me if I'm going too slowly. The second MP is George Hamilton. He was at Trinity as well, the Belfast MP, but for a shorter period, as you see there, 1768 to 76. The Hamiltons, his father was Alexander Hamilton. He was the MP for Killilea in the Irish Parliament, and he was married to Isabella Maxwell of Finnebrogue. You probably know Finnebrogue's outside Downpatrick. So the family had a base there at Finnebrogue, but his father bought land at Balbriggan. So the family settled, and George was particularly responsible for the development of the estate, which they had acquired at Balbriggan. And he developed the town and its pier and industry in the town. And there's a little harbour. I went to see it recently on the way back from Dublin, and there's a little harbour. It's still there, his prime pier. Now, Ball's Judges of Ireland, because you see he became a High Court judge, so he stopped being an MP when he got an appointment. But he was in the High Court then from 76 until he died. Ball's Judges of Ireland comments on him. It said, in effect, he was a terrible bore because he wouldn't stop talking about Balbriggan. The comment in the book is, only some great preoccupation could cause him to go for more than 15 minutes without mentioning Balbriggan Pier. Wasn't they pleased? Also, and perhaps a reflection of the times, it says, he mortgaged his vote to the government by accepting aid for the expense of his maintaining a troop of light horse in Balbriggan. So he got his reward for supporting the government, and they funded his platoon, whatever it was, of light horse. As I said there, he became a High Court judge. His son, Alexander, later became an MP for Belfast in 1798. And his other son, George, became a rector, and he served in Torella in County Down. So the family, his grandson died without any children, so the Balbriggan connection was lost. The estate was sold after that. So those are the public representatives. And you see they're really Chichester's men in effect. Now, the church representatives. I love this photograph. It's the one in the corner, as James has pointed out to me, in the bottom photographs there of the three at the bottom. He's there, and I just see, this is how I imagine if you've got a film made of a Jane Austen novel and they have the parson in it, that is exactly the guy who I think they would cast in the role, because he looks so much the part. He's the vicar of Belfast. He was 38 at the time. He too was at Trinity. And you will remember that the Church of Ireland was the established church at that time. So it was the state church. And he was the vicar of what was called the Corporation Church. Now, it stood on the site of St. George's in High Street. But it was demolished in 1774 because it had again fallen into disrepair. And a new church was built, which opened in 1776. And it was on the site of St. Anne's Cathedral. So that was the St. Anne's Parish Church, opened there at that time. So on the site in High Street, we now have St. George's Church, which was built in 1818. And on the site of the parish church, we now have the cathedral, which was opened in 1902, I think. So that was the changeover. He moved from the old church, which wasn't rebuilt for some years, and took his place on the site of the cathedral. You see, he was also sovereign. So he was in quite an important position. He was leading the church and he was leading the town in a sense, because he was sovereign on 11 occasions there. And his role as a sovereign also included his role as a magistrate. So I just want to say a little word about the Belfast Academy, which I'll come back to in a moment. But Belfast Academy opened in 1786, and it was in Academy Street. And there was a difficulty which any teachers amongst us probably didn't have to meet today, but there was a riot in the school, and Bristow, as the magistrate was called, and he read the Riot Act, which was a warning that the military would come in and quell the disturbance if we didn't disperse. The response from the boys in the school was that a pistol was fired at the magistrate. Fortunately, they didn't hit him, but a gun was discharged. Well, the boys were all expelled for that, of course. And I'm not quite sure whether it has happened in the academy since, but I don't believe so. So that was the Reverend Bristow. I've said he was liberal in religion and conservative in politics, because, of course, he lives through a momentous time in Ireland, 1736 to 1808. He lives through the rebellion and the Union and so on. So liberal in religion because he donated. There was no Catholic church in Belfast until 1784, and he donated a pulpit from one of the Church of Ireland churches to the new chapel, which was in Chapel Lane in Belfast. But it didn't open at that time. It wasn't a parish priest. Parish priest was Hugh O'Donnell of Derryahe, and he served by having celebrations in a house in Belfast before the church chapel was built in 1784. And so in that sense, I describe him as liberal in religion. Professor Barclay, who's a Presbyterian historian, didn't regard him as liberal as far as the Presbyterians were concerned, because he closed down the Sunday school that had been opened by the Presbyterians. And of course, there was tension between the Presbyterians and the Anglicans at that time, but conservative in politics because he was opposed to the radicals of the time. So that was the Reverend William Bristow. He was the first churchman appointed. Adele Cunningham, I mentioned earlier, he was the church warden of Belfast. I'm not entirely clear why the church warden merited a position, but they granted the church warden a post on the board for some reason. The church warden was interesting in that at that time, the church warden was elected by the inhabitants. So this was the most representative appointment made. You remember that the town council and the MPs were only elected by the burgesses, not the inhabitants of the town. The inhabitants of the town only was to vote for the church warden, and he was the church warden of the parish church. But you didn't have to be Anglican in order to be elected the church warden. And as you see, Adele Cunningham was a member of Second Presbyterian, so he got elected anyway, and he was entitled, if you were non-Anglican, to nominate someone to do the duties for you and to ensure that there was peace and good order in the church. But of course, you, although you nominated someone, remained responsible. Interesting fellow, Cunningham, because as a young man, he went to America, made a fortune there, bought an estate in Dominica, which he called Belfast. Of course, any estate at that time had to be slavery involved. So unfortunately, he was a slave owner. But he came back to Belfast at that time. And it was he who bought up the leases that led to the Hearts of Steel dispute. And it was his house that was set on fire when the Hearts of Steel came into Belfast. He was captain of the Volunteers. Now, at this time, the Volunteers were being formed initially because the troops, British troops, were in America because of the American War of Independence. There was a threat of French invasion of Ireland. There was no domestic troop. There were no domestic troops. Volunteers emerged, They were voluntary, of course, and they were defense force in anticipation of the French invasion. But then there wasn't a French invasion of any import, and they turned their attention to trade restrictions, which had been imposed by England on Ireland, and those trade restrictions were removed. And then they turned their attention to legislative independence for Ireland, and that was achieved in 1782 when Britain's Parliament was formed, and you no longer were subject to control by Westminster Parliament. So the volunteers established quite a lot within a very short period of time, and captain of volunteers wearing the volunteer uniform, as you'll see there, with the red coat. He was captain of volunteers. They tried then, the next step was parliamentary reform, because Waddell Cunningham couldn't get elected as MP for Belfast because he didn't get on with Chichester. And he tried to be elected in Carrickfergus instead, which had a broader electorate. But they were campaigning for extended vote and extended representation in Parliament. And he supported that campaign. Now, moving along to the churchmen, there's 3 Presbyterians coming up. And that's because in Belfast in 1774, there were 3 Presbyterian churches. So we just had the Anglicans, no Catholics, none of the others, and 3 Presbyterian churches. Gives you an idea that this was indeed a Presbyterian town. The majority population were Presbyterian. First, second, and third Presbyterian. The first had been established. That's it in the foreground there on the left. That's First Presbyterian. It was rebuilt in 1783, and that's the rebuilt version, post 1783. Behind it is Second Presbyterian, because the first one was full up, had to build a second one. It was rebuilt in 1790, that's the rebuilt version, so that picture, engraving, whatever it is, was post 1790. There's the 2 churches. And then in 1722, the Third Presbyterian was built, and it was across the road on the other side of Rosemary Street. So the first is rebuilt, and there's a new church there now, as you know, and you can go and visit it. It's a magnificent interior. If you haven't been, you must go and see it. Look inside, it's fantastic. Second Presbyterian was demolished. Third Presbyterian is not there, but there's a plaque there on the other side of the road. Tells you where the church used to be. So the Reverend James Mackay was the minister of First Presbyterian Church. Couldn't find a picture of him or a portrait of him. Had to go for the Reverend Thomas Drennan, who was his predecessor. I'll come back to him in a moment because I want to say something about the churches there. The 3 churches reflect the schism in Presbyterianism between the non-subscribers and the subscribers. First and second are non-subscribing. Third Presbyterian is a subscribing church. Now, the difference is subscribing to a code of discipline or practice or in faith. And the non-subscribers won't do that. They're, apologies if I don't get this right, for any non-subscribers who may be in the room. The non-subscribing view is that faith is determined as a matter of personal conscience based on interpretation of the Bible. And that is your code of conduct. You do not need a man-made declaration of articles of faith. The Presbyterian Church Standard does accept the Westminster Confession as a man-made articles of faith. The non-subscribers reject that. They do not accept that it's necessary to have. So that distinction arose very early on in 1725 in order to address how you would deal with this. Presbyterian Church set up a separate presbytery which accommodated those who refused to subscribe to articles of faith, and it was called the Presbytery of Antrim. So they were part of a different group, but within the same Presbyterian Church. They were to separate properly. Later, as you now know, there are two different churches. But first and second were non-subscribers. When this dispute came to a head in 1722, those who wanted to subscribe left the first and the second, crossed the road, built their own church, made Third Presbyterian. And that was how that came about. Now, the Thomas Drennan was his predecessor there, as you see, and I put him in because he's the father of William Drennan, Dr. William Drennan, who was the physician to the Charitable Society here. Now, he trained as a doctor, William Drennan, and you may know him as a founder of the United Irishmen and promoter of reform, campaigner for universal suffrage at the time, inventor of the expression Emerald Isle, and later founder of INST in 1814. So the Reverend James Mackay was the minister of the church. He died unmarried in 1781. Now, he's the first of 3 Presbyterians who are named in this legislation. And I want to point out how remarkable that is, because bear in mind what I said about the dispute between Anglicanism and Presbyterianism at that time. We all know about the penal laws and the exclusion of Catholics at that time, but I'm focusing, because of the personnel involved here, on the distinction between the Anglicans and the Presbyterians. And I want to say something about the status of the Presbyterians at that time. No Presbyterian was allowed to hold any public office. That had been established in earlier legislation, Ireland in 1704. The result was that those Presbyterians who were then on the city council had to leave, and there was one MP and he had to leave, and they were replaced by members of the Anglican community. And that was removed in 1782. So at this time, there was no entitlement to hold public office. And for Roman Catholics, that wasn't removed until 1793, 10 years later. There was no admission to Trinity College Dublin. It was an Anglican university. Now, I've told you the 3 previous people, and they were all admitted to Trinity and did their degrees at Trinity. There was no Irish university to accommodate the Presbyterians. They went to Scotland, where, of course, the Presbyterianism is the Church of Scotland. So they're trained in Scotland. And for Catholics, there's no training there either. They have to go to the continent. Hugh O'Donnell, who was the parish priest of Derryahy, went to the Irish College in Salamanca, as did many of the priests of the time. So there was no admission. The marriages performed by Presbyterian ministers were invalid. They were not recognized because Presbyterian ministers were not considered to have been ordained, because ordination was said to be requiring episcopal ordination. That is, had to be performed by a bishop. And the Presbyterian ethos is no bishops, no hierarchy like that. So the marriages were not recognized. So the children were illegitimate and inheritance rules applied. Of course, you overcome that by going to the vicar, and the vicar will perform a ceremony after you've been married in Presbyterian fashion by your own minister. But to avoid that, you would then go and get married in the Anglican church. And of course, the Presbyterians had no vote in Belfast because they weren't allowed to be on the council, because that was a public office, and only the 13 members of the council were entitled to vote. So if you ask yourself, why was there so much radicalism among the Presbyterians in Belfast in the 1790s? That's part of it. They were excluded from the administration of the... and that makes it all the more remarkable that the Anglican Parliament, which passed the Act, included the 3 Presbyterian ministers that they did in the legislation. But that's a sign of the easing of the tensions and the history of that, because a lot of these measures are about to be revoked in the next 10 to 20 years as the new Parliament comes in and it changes these rules and reintroduces equality between the different denominations. Of course, marriages didn't gain equality until 1844, so it was quite a long time before that was recognized. And of course, Catholic emancipation didn't develop fully, although they got a removal of a lot of Catholic relief measures in 1793. It was 1829 before emancipation was achieved, and they were allowed to sit in Parliament. So that, and of course, William Drennan, son of Thomas Drennan, was to the fore in campaigning for the change of these measures. Here's the Reverend James Crombie. At the time, I think I'm two more to do. James Crombie was the assistant to Mackay, and he was the minister. He followed him as the minister of First Presbyterian. He was from Scotland there, as you see. And he founded Belfast Royal Academy. And in 1786, and he was the principal, he was the first principal there until his death only 4 years later. Now, he preached in his volunteer uniform, so you can tell that he too campaigned for the volunteer movement's ambitions. But he died in 1790, so he's in the early stage of the volunteer movement. They're looking for parliamentary reform at an early stage. He preached in his uniform, but also did a daring thing. He delivered a sermon, which is still available online, and it was published at the time, advocating the compatibility of Christianity with drilling on the Sabbath. And of course, adherence to the Sabbath it still remains strong amongst many groups and people, but it was presumably largely anathema in 1774 to suggest that you should do such a thing. But anyway, he promoted this, he published this sermon in which he justified the drilling in the defense of the nation and so on the Sabbath. Not that it didn't draw condemnation from other quarters. Anyway, he preached in his volunteer uniform, and that attracted many of his congregation to wear their uniforms when they came to Sunday service to show where their loyalties lay at that time. He had a son, Joseph, who was born in 1776. So at the time of the rebellion, he would have been 22. He was arrested in 1798, but he managed to escape, and he went to America. And the widow, James Crombie's widow, and the rest of the family went to Scotland. So they probably thought better of staying. Now, the last person I want to speak to is Reverend William Laird, who is of Third Presbyterian, Rosemary Street. A fine-looking church, as you see there. And this is part of the subscribing church, the subscribing Presbyterian church. William Laird was a long-time minister, 1721 to 1791 is his year of birth, but I'm looking to see, he has 1747 was when he came to Third Presbyterian. So Henry Joy McCracken was a member of Third Presbyterian Church. The McCracken family were members of that church, and Mary Ann McCracken, they were members of that church. Now, the succeeding, I put in the Reverend Sinclair Kilburn there because he succeeded the Reverend William Laird as the minister of Third Presbyterian. And he published a sermon in 1791, the morality of the Sabbath defended. In other words, it was a rebuttal of the Crombie sermon on drilling on the Sabbath. He wasn't having any drilling on the Sabbath. But that wasn't to say that he didn't approve of drilling, because he too wore his uniform, his volunteer uniform, when he was in the preaching. And he carried his musket with him as well. And that encouraged the members of the congregation to do the same. And when he made a particularly good point, it is said that they banged the butts of their rifles on the floor in approval. Not that any shots were to fire. Muskets like that one there on the shelf over there, I suppose. So he was very much involved in the radical side, although he was conservative in his religious views and wanted to adhere to the Sabbath. He was quite supportive of the radical volunteers. Now, he's there in the 1790s, 91 to 99, and there's a revival of the volunteers at that time. And as you know, it leads on to the United Irishmen and the rebellion. And Kilburn seems to have been involved with that group. And he campaigned through the Northern Star and was a founding member of that newspaper, which was the voice of the United Irishmen. And when the volunteers were suppressed and they were making arrests, Henry Joy McCracken was taken to Kilmainham in 1797, and so was the Reverend Sinclair Kilburn, who of course was his minister at that time. And he was taken there, but it had a very bad effect on his health. He was released in 1798. He attended the execution of Henry Joy in 1798, but he retired shortly afterwards, 1799, and he died in 1802 at the age of 48. So his health had been very seriously affected at that time. So as for the third Presbyterian church, it was damaged in the Blitz in 1941, unfortunately, and it had to be demolished. And the congregation moved to North Circular Road, and you now know them as Rosemary Presbyterian on the North Circular Road. Second Presbyterian, they weren't mentioned there because the church was vacant in 1774, but that church closed in 1896, and its congregation moved to Elmwood Avenue. So it's not the church at the Queen's End, it's the church at the other end, Lisburn Road End, All Souls. The Second Presbyterian amalgamated with them. Non-subscribers, first, non-subscribers. Third, I should have said, are subscribers. First, I've mentioned already, Rosemary Street, still there, and well worth a visit. First meeting of the Incorporated Society, there you are. These are the ones that I've mentioned who attended the first meeting, and it was held in the Market House, and that's High Street where you see the people walking along. If you keep walking away from the camera, you come down to the Lagan at the end of High Street. So that was the meeting place at the time, because this house, although it opened in 1774, was not ready until November for them to meet. Between 1774 and 1800 was a very momentous time, as I've said, and great changes took place, but it was a very radical time that those men lived through, but all changed with the Act of Union in 1800, and a new generation comes into play, and loyalties change at that time, and that's another story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Ronnie, for a very interesting and informative talk there. I'm going to open it up to the floor. Does anyone have any questions for Sir Ronnie?
There's some talk, sorry if I
Go
can.
ahead, Eugene.
That the Charitable Society was set up at a pub in 1752. And that seems a bit a contradiction, given that a lot of these men were clergymen. So is that an urban myth?
No.
No, they definitely met in the George Inn, so they did. Because suppose like pubs, they were communal areas where people would have met to discuss things.
The clergy?
Even the clergymen. There you go.
Well, there was one clergyman and all the rest were merchants, I think.
Yes.
So it was the vicar was there, I think. Margetson, is that his
Yes.
name? Otherwise, it was a merchant venture.
Where was the pub again?
The George.
George Inn, so it was What's it called?
Off High Street
North
somewhere.
Yes. Any other questions?
So Ronnie, now what sort of have you captured? Thank you very much for that. That's really, really interesting. But just a wee thing. Whenever we're talking about Shaftesbury and the ownership, is it something that you would have looked into? There was a big court case at the time. Was it the Great Theft of Ulster? Francis Joseph Vicar got involved in. It was all to do with the ownership, or the original ownership of the law. It was contested. Chichester didn't do it properly, or it was granted properly. Did you ever do any work on that?
Yes, there was a case that went to the Court of Appeal in Northern Ireland in the 1960s, and it was a challenge it was to do with the fishing rights in the loch and who owned the fishing rights and so forth. And it confirmed that the Chichester title was correct, and I think it was much too complicated to try and unravel. That probably directed the result of the case as much as anything. But yes, when Chichester was Lord Deputy, there were various grants made of different lands at different times, and one of them was a grant. Several of them were grants to Chichester of rights in relation to Lough Neagh, and one of them was an appointment as Admiral of Lough Neagh. But those are disputed as to whether he'd written them himself, in effect, or whether they genuinely were. He was in a prime position to do it because he was the Lord Deputy, so he was the King's representative in Dublin. So he would be able to determine these things. You had to do it by letters patent and so on, and he would have issued them. So there's every reason to believe that he didn't seek to undermine his own advantage. I would expect. What became critical was that after the Restoration in 1660, there was a re-grant of lands at that point. And so the title, whatever you think about what went on before, the title was confirmed at the Restoration. And generally the title is taken from that re-grant in 1660, by which time, of course, the first Chichester had died. And so the case found that that was the position, and all the subsequent entitlements prevailed. But there's a difference between the rights to the bed and the rights to the loch. And the rights to the loch are owned by the Shaftesburys, and that's descended through the Harriet Chichester marrying into the Shaftesbury family. And yes, there was another, the first Governor General of the Irish Free State was Tim Healy. And Tim Healy wrote a book which was to challenge Chichester's entitlement by saying, in effect, that he'd written all these grants for himself, and therefore they were invalid and it was all fraudulent. So
I was having an observation. Arthur Chichester fifth Earl. I've been doing some work through the things. Actually attended a couple of the meetings. From what I could see, he was actually present.
oh, good.
Chairperson here. But
It was in this room then, I hope.
Well, I think so.
Yeah, I guess so.
But he kind of gets a bit of a bad rap in Belfast. He does seem to have been involved in a lot of stuff. You mentioned that his estate worth, an annual worth was X amount of pounds. He did go ahead and do the Lagan Canal, which apparently was the equivalent of 2 years worth of income of his Irish estates. So it would have been a considerable investment, as well as obviously given some 19 acres.
Yes, well, he granted that, and he granted the land for the parish church as well. And the family gave Belfast Castle and Ormo Park. So yes, there were lands given away as well as sold.
Any other questions? Do you have a question?
What's the difference between a poorhouse and
Well, yes. The workhouse system was introduced in 1840, and the workhouse in Belfast was in where the city hospital now is. And the work that is based on public funding. The poorhouse has always been voluntarily funded and receives no public money, and that remains the case today, and any contributions that you wish to make will be gratefully received on a voluntary basis. But when the workhouses were introduced, it was provided that all houses of industry, as they were called, that had received any public funding would fall into the hands of the Poor Law Commissioners. So this house became at risk because question, had the Charitable Society received any public funding? And there was a bit of debate about that for a time, but eventually it was decided that no, it hadn't received public funding, although it did receive, I needn't go into it, but it did receive money from different sources which were arguably public funding, but it avoided all that and has remained in private hands.
Great. Any other questions? Questions online? So just to wrap up this evening's talks, just wanted to cover a couple of our upcoming events and tours. So next month is your last chance before we go on a short winter break to attend any of our public tours. But don't fret, and as anyone knows me in Clifton House, I do love Christmas. So I will be back, or we will be back for our Christmas tours in December, and we have, by popular demand, is bringing back our very Victorian crafty Christmas, which I know a few people have already booked on to in advance. We do have a couple of different talks as well. So in celebration of Black History Month, we have Dr. Philomena Mullen coming from Trinity College, Dublin, to uncover the history of Black lives in Ireland, which sounds really interesting because I didn't realise that Black people were living in Ireland since Viking age in Ireland as well. So it proves to be a very interesting talk. And then to end the year, we have our very own James, who is seated behind, giving a talk again by popular demand on body snatching in 19th century Belfast. And lastly, on your seats, and I do have pens on either side of the room, I would be very grateful if you could take a couple of minutes of your time to fill out our surveys. Just the information in them helps to form our next series of talks and tours. And just to end it, we thank Sir Ronnie once again for his very interesting talk, and thank you for coming this evening. Thank you very much.